This is the kind of video a man should watch. Rick and his father came to a friend's gravel pit. There's an old cable crane parked here. According to their friend, this big guy is from the 40s or 50s. It's not hydraulically driven, but cable driven. It's been parked here for a long time. And Rick and his father's task today is to get its resurrection is starting, because his friend has sold this mine. His favorite thing here is this dragline excavator. If he can get it moving again, he can directly drive it away, instead of it belonging to the new owner. You can also tell from the tracks that it's been abandoned for quite some time. All the windows were smashed during that time. Fortunately, this place is located in the desert, and the climate is dry, so the interior isn't too bad. The various components inside the cockpit look very old. This control lever can still be moved. Aside from being a little stiff, it's not completely stuck. This kind of old machinery isn't actually that complex. By observing how each lever is pulled, I can roughly figure out their respective functions. They're basically all clever mechanical principles, and in this regard, the old man's experience is even richer. He operated similar cranes in his youth, so he's quite familiar with them. It's worth mentioning that this big guy's heart is an inline 6-cylinder gasoline engine. The radiator in the front is ridiculously large. It stands there like a tombstone. There's also an exit on the roof. I can climb directly onto the roof just by pushing it. I also found a toolbox in the engine compartment, but there are only some odds and ends left in it. It wasn't much help to them. You can see, this house-like space is quite spacious. Several people can stand inside, with no problem at all. They started trying to turn the crankshaft, but it looks like it's a bit difficult. They'll have to get tools later to try. The throttle cable is a bit sticky from being in use for so long. Then, I pulled out the dipstick. There's still a small amount of oil in it. It should be enough to start it. And its simple instrument panel is located right above the engine. It only has water temperature, voltage, and oil pressure gauges. The battery next to it was long gone. Fortunately, the connection terminal was still intact. He could follow the wires to find the power switch. The old man originally planned to disassemble the access port and directly pry the flywheel to rotate it, but Rick found a handy tool. It would be more effective to rotate it directly this way, with the help of leverage. The crankshaft finally started to loosen, and after slowly turning it 49 times, it finally became easier. The old man then set about removing the spark plugs. Although the removed spark plugs had some rust, they were still within acceptable condition. After a little polishing and cleaning, they should still be usable. This is much better than I expected. After removing all the spark plugs, I poured some ATF lubricant directly in. I added some to each cylinder, to let them soak thoroughly. After a while, we grabbed a spare battery, and planned to turn on the power, see if the electric fuel pump will work. And the result is I can hear the fuel pump running. But the engine doesn't have any issues. The starter motor has no response. Dad instructs Rick to grab a piece of wire and connect it directly to the starter. By constantly touching the positive terminal, the old man discovers the starter motor occasionally turns briefly. He figured it's probably because it's been sitting for too long. There might be some rust or something inside causing it to stick, so he asked his son to get his hammer from the car. Then he carefully aligned it and tapped it, hoping to loosen it up a bit. Still not satisfied, he took a screwdriver and disassembled the starter motor. Observing the internal situation, after a thorough inspection, I confirmed there was no internal damage. I had Rick turn the power back on. This time, when he pressed the switch, the engine finally. You can see from here as well, with the continuous rotation, a large amount of rust and dust started to fall out from inside the starter motor, after it had been soaking for a while. As the engine started to run, the old man used his finger to cover the spark plug hole, to check if the cylinders were building compression. He tested each one in turn, and the results were very satisfying. All cylinders were working properly. It can produce compression normally. Then, the old man started to use sandpaper to polish the rusty spark plugs. Meanwhile, Rick took apart the distributor. Surprisingly, the inside of the distributor was very clean. It didn't look rusty at all, still like new. I've dealt with all the spark plugs here, starting to put them all back. To be on the safe side, Rick sanded some of the contacts. He sanded them down. Then he poured some fuel into the fuel line, to see if the fuel pump can pump fuel. I'll also check if the fuel line is clogged. After disconnecting the fuel line from the carburetor, he starts pressing the starter button. You can see fuel starting to flow out. This means the fuel pump and fuel line are fine, and the throttle linkage isn't stuck either. He tightens the fuel line again, and reinstalls the distributor. Now we need to determine the firing order. My old man has his own little rhyme for that. He says his high school teacher once told him that the firing order for all inline-six engines is basically 1 5 3 6 2 4. It should work here too. Rick took his dad's advice and started sorting the ignition wires, connecting them in order. Fortunately, before connecting them, I still need to test if they produce a spark. After installing all the spark plugs in order, Rick removes the air filter to check the carburetor underneath. He finds nothing unusual inside. Then he crawls through the sunroof onto the roof and removes the cover on the exhaust pipe. Then I started adding fresh water to the long-dried radiator. Pot after pot of fresh water poured in. The leaks started to become apparent. There was no better way. I could only tighten some of the loose bolts to slow the leaks. Immediately after, I tried starting it again. Dad observed from the side. After a few unsuccessful attempts, Dad brought some starter fluid. He helped Rick continue trying to start it. This time there was a noticeable effect. After a few short tries, the engine suddenly roared to life. The exhaust pipe beside them sputtered smoke. From the sound of it, the engine's running strong. The simple dashboard also responded immediately. Besides smoke, the exhaust pipe is also leaking quite a bit of liquid. Some of it is the fuel I added earlier, and some is rusty water. I guess water somehow got into the exhaust pipe. Luckily, it didn't get into the engine. At this moment, the old man sat in the driver's seat. I started trying to pull the control panel. Tried it for a few minutes. Various winches and rollers beside it started to turn. This sudden rotation also filled the cabin with dust. But this big guy had indeed come back to life. Then I started to control the boom. I found that these long booms can still be freely raised and lowered, but I also found that some of the tie rods are stuck. So here, I still need to spray some lubricating oil on them and try to loosen and release them. After a period of familiarization, I'm now going to get this crane moving. And it didn't disappoint. The crane started to move slowly back and forth. After a bit of swaying, Rick finally managed to pull it out from where it had been parked for years, and he even tested the winch. It worked perfectly. There were no problems at all. He then rotated the crane. The steering is still very smooth. I have to say, these old machines are sometimes really trustworthy. Even after being abandoned for years, they can be brought back to life, and it seems that they can continue to work without any problems. Since that's the case, Rick and his son's task for today is complete. Done. I just need to find some time to drive it away later, and that's it. So here, this rope pulling crane's road to resurrection has come to an end. If you like it, please double tap and follow. See you next time.